The reason I wrote this book was to see how Australians had once been encouraged by their government to understand the nation's international responsibilities to refugee protection and why refugees should be brought ashore and have their claims for protection processed.
I read Claire's book, Asylum by Boat, and it was with a sense of where the hell was she 15 years ago when I needed this information.
In my attempt to go behind the scenes on the Fraser government, I sifted through hundreds of files at the National Archives in Canberra, and I interviewed dozens of former immigration officials who very kindly shared their memories with me and their perspective. So the story begins with 5 young men who made their way to Australia on the promise of taking a chance there, that it might be less dangerous than going somewhere else. That was in April 1976. By the time Fraser left office in March 1983, 60,000 Indo-Chinese refugees had been resettled in Australia. He said to me that his government had not conducted polling on whether or not Australia should accept refugees, whether or not we should accept the asylum seekers who were sailing into Darwin Harbour. All the evidence that I found in the archives and press releases, ministers' speeches, and in talking to these former immigration officials, I saw how they had tried to encourage the public. They had framed the reception of asylum seekers positively.
But what it shows in this book is that even then, even from the very first, Australia and the Australian Public Service was looking for the magic deterrent that would stop people coming. The search that continues even today. We have spent 40 years pursuing strategies that we know do not work. Locking them up in Port Hedland, locking them up elsewhere, locking them up on Christmas Island, locking them up on Manus and Nauru, locking them up somewhere with a dream that someone else, some other country, will take them off our hands. And in the meantime, the cruelties simply intensify.
And this is one reason why I wrote this book. Because turnbacks, mandatory detention, and harsh, negative rhetoric make history in the worst way. And we must look to history if we are to better understand how to potentially change that.
The Pacific Solution Mark I shut down back then because it was just too cruel to keep the last few people on Nauru. They were going mad. They were literally going mad. You cite the cases, the conventions, the cabinet meetings, the resolutions. And it struck me that if the members of the High Court would read your book, they might at last realise that this detention is not, as they have claimed for so long, administrative. That it was never designed to be administrative. It was always designed to deter. It was always punitive. Maybe they will read it and finally listen.
If we can identify one thing that has changed in the last 40 years, it would be political leadership on refugees coming to Australia. And if there was one thing that we could change, it would be communicating with the Australian public why asylum seekers should have their claims for protection processed in Australia fairly and efficiently.